Okay, so today we're going to be exploring the mental health child protection paradigm. I'll probably do an introduction this time. My name is Richard Williams. I'm a senior lecturer at Bournemouth University. Colin Pritchard, Professor Chair of Professor Emeritus at the School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry in Southampton University, and Chair Professor of Psychiatric Social Work at Bournemouth University. This is an area that we've shared, you've explored over a longer period of time than I have, obviously, but we've shared the journey for a few years now. And it's a paradigm that I think is relevant, and hence this recording. So I'll ask you to start us off, please, Colin.
Thanks very much, Richard. Yes, I would emphasise the number of research projects you and I have done together, literally from 1992 onwards and so on. And I actually started my main social work career in child psychiatry. We had the system there of psychiatric social work, clinical psychologists, educational psychologists, and the child psychiatrist. We dealt with the family. The psychiatrist played with the children, and that's how it was in many ways. And the educational psychologist did lots of IQ tests. But of course, in many ways, my career reflects the changing nature of social work, to the extent that, in a sense, this recording has been influenced by, I've just been invited to do a review of your and my paper, Child Abuse Related Deaths and Child Mortality in the UK and the Western World, 2019, by the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry for their latest issue. And of course, we're really looking at what happened to children being killed by an adult. It may be surprised some of our younger colleagues, but child abuse related deaths were not high on the agenda until the 1960s, when Kempe did a very important paper called Battered Baby Syndrome. And this caused a lot of media interest. And indeed, it reached our shores in 1968. Unfortunately, I was then a principal psychiatric social worker and was asked by the Yorkshire Television to comment on Kempe's paper. And I had the effrontery to say, oh, it's typical American hyperbole. You know, we understand when people, when the rare parent kills the child, it's mental illness, etc. And our legislation was much more humane than the Americans. What we didn't realise is that Kempe, we were right and wrong at the same time. And suddenly we started having high-profile deaths of children in the United Kingdom, and they seemed to be happening every month, every week, and the media was going crazy. And social work, we were right in the front line, or rather, my colleagues in the children's department in the front line, and we're getting slated. I was in child psychiatry, so in this sense, the children's department were almost quite separate. We were just a not integrated service. This is one of the weaknesses of health and social services for the past 30, 40 years, and it's still a problem. However, there had been a particularly nasty case, and I said to myself, oh, can't children's departments get it right? So what I did for the first time, and published in 1992 in the Journal of Social Work, I asked a simple question. Okay, how many child abuse related deaths are there? How many were there in the 1970s? And how many are there now in then 1988 was the latest figures we got. And to my pleasant surprise, every country except America had reduced its child abuse related deaths substantially. And now that was really very good. And if we can continue, we were fourth highest child killer. And depending on how you want to do the counting, today we're fourth lowest out of the 21 Western countries. And that's really quite something. And I say the latest paper on this, because in many ways, Richard, you and I have almost made exclusive analysis of child-related deaths internationally for the last 20 years. Nobody else has done it because Pritchard and Williams are doing it. Sorry, that was a commercial. And this recent paper was really very good. But we also looked at child mortality, non-ordinary child mortality. So what I'm now going to talk about is hidden successes, namely, we are right down. We have really fallen considerably. We've only got, for infants, that's 0 to 1, 2 per million children a year. For children 0 to 4, it's 2 per million, which is 0.002. The Americans, for infants, is 70 per million, and for 0 to 4s is 31 per million. Americans are 15 times worse than, on the other hand, they're 10 times worse than most everybody else. And taking that period, this is a hidden success, because after all, child protection has been led by British social work. We reduced our child abuse related deaths more than 40 other Western countries. And of course, more than America. And everybody has reduced their child abuse related deaths except New Zealand and the Americans. However, there's a hidden failure. And I'll mention Saint Marcus Rashford. If he hasn't been canonized, he'll certainly get on an MBE, he'll certainly get his knighthood, rightly, for highlighting child poverty. Now, Marcus Rashford, Pritchard and Williams, what's the connection? In the same paper, we looked at child mortality. Now, here's the good news. Every country's deaths for children 0 to 4 had a bit considerable fall. The Americans, even the Americans, from 2,480 per million down to 1,280 per million. They've reduced their death rate in the last 30 years by 48%. Britain by 51%. That's not quite good enough to meet the United Nations Declaration Millennium Goals of 2% per annum. And why is that? Because whilst we did better than most other countries reducing abuse deaths, 9 other countries have had a bigger reduction in child mortality than we Brits. And the Americans, 14 other countries have had a bigger reduction of child mortality. Why? The Americans have got the highest income inequality, relative poverty in the West. We've got the 3rd worst relative poverty in the West and 5th highest child mortality. And that's a hidden failure. And delinquent governments don't want to talk about it. So when Marcus Rashford comes along and says we must do something practical about child poverty, not only are children going hungry and therefore their biopsychosocial development is being impaired, and therefore not only do you inherit poverty, but you inherit some of the physiological consequences and at the extreme mortality. Now, of course, these big figures, international figures, are all very interesting for social policy makers and perhaps even politicians. But what does it do for the frontline social worker? And that's where we have to be sensible. Some years ago, actually in the 1980s, a new problem emerged in the media, and that was child sexual abuse. And again, younger colleagues may not realize it wasn't high on the public agenda or radar. And the local county, actually Hampshire and Dorset, had got all these cases of child sexual abuse and wanted to have some understanding of them. So they invited us in to look at these child cases. So we actually examined 348 cases of convicted men of child sex abuse. And what was useful about this, we could recognize there were different categories, different behavioral categories based upon what these men actually did. 48% of them were sex only. The only offence they'd had, and I'm not diminishing it, was a sexual offence with a child. But the reason, and a lot of them had sometimes 50, 60, 100 different kids a year. But what that showed you, that was a one-off case in individual children. Because the real problem was when they involved the children in an ongoing longitudinal relationship. That's where the damage came in, not just the quick, frankly, it sounds hideous, a kiddie fiddle in some obscure place. Then 32% were men who got involved with children who also had other convictions for crime, burglary, breaking and entering and things like this, etc. So they were multi-criminal and child sex abusers. And then there was 18%, and these are the group who really frightened me, violent, multi-criminal and child sex abusers. And these are the groups who really frightened me. The problem was these figures, it's still some of the hardest longitudinal studies we've got. 70% of these offenders were extra family offenders. Extra family offenders, because intra-family offenders, within family offenders, might go to the police and then withdrew their evidence. And what we found was a classical case, an example, a middle-class family. The father had been abusing this child from the age of 9. Actually, it was a case I got involved in. The father had died, and this is a really good case example. The father had died in his 80s. The mother, the young woman now is in her 50s, professional woman, etc. And she had an atypical depression. She couldn't grieve for her father. And she found her way to me, and I was working with her. And the first session, she was simply told me how wonderful her father had been, etc., etc. But she couldn't feel anything at his loss, and so on. To get a long, boring story short, after 3 sessions, I began to realize things were not quite as they appeared. And suddenly, this lady changed before my eyes, and she started crying with rage, because she said, I don't think my father really loved me. But I was saying, Mrs. Bloggs, you'd said earlier, then she suddenly said in rage, how could he love me when he couldn't hear the cries of pain when he raped his 9-year-old daughter? I've never forgotten that. It pinned me to my seat. I just couldn't imagine it. And then as she related tearfully how the sexual behavior had continued until when she was nearly 16 and she'd become Daddy's special friend. Of course, she was not told, she couldn't tell anybody, etc. Suddenly it was discovered by the mother. The mother blamed the daughter. And of course, being middle class, it stopped immediately and they didn't go to the authorities. One case example to probably illustrate what we know from psychiatric cases, that the worst consequences of child sex abuse is when it happens within the home. Now, the police were very pleased because they began to realize they could deal with these men in different ways. So they then gave me a decade of child abuse related deaths, a whole 10 years in the 2 counties of 4% of the UK population. It's the biggest longitudinal case record of child abuse related deaths in one region. And I could almost ask our colleagues, in 10 years in Hampshire and Dorset, how many children do you think died? Very quickly, I'll tell you, 33 and 23 assailants. 5 assailants were extra family and all were violent, multi-criminal child sex abusers with violence against women as well. And all got long life sentences and quite rightly so. The others, the main category were parents who were mentally ill. Now that quite shocked me. And then the other group, there was 4 of them, men who were stepfathers who were also violent multi-criminal. And then there's the other group, well, just two of them, were women who were on the child protection register. Now, because we knew, we had some idea of how many mentally ill people in the general population, because we had police records to know how many men had these violent convictions.
I'm gonna very quickly, sorry, apologies, just for colleagues who are reading this, who are listening to this now. So for many people who might be looking at this, would not have heard of a child protection register. It's something that used to be in place a few years ago, when if a child was deemed to be at risk of significant harm through the child protection procedures, would be placed on something called a child protection register. Now young children are subject to a child protection plan, and just so that's just a different context in terms of how we understand it. So sorry for interrupting.
Not at all. Now let me tell you, I was trying to get some idea of risk, and of course the violent multi-criminal child sex abuser was the smallest group. He was 5 out of 23 assailants, but based on death rates, he killed at a rate of 8,000 per million, namely 0.08%, because numbers can have a different meaning. Mentally ill fathers killed at 40 per million, mentally ill mothers killed at 100 per million, cancer deaths at 30 per million, so it's a clinical number. But when you look at mothers, mentally ill mothers, as a percentage who killed, it was 0.001%. So we're talking about something actually statistically very, very rare. And that's something I want to come back to, that child abuse related deaths, when they happen, are horrendous, almost unthinkable. It's so unnatural, it offends everything about being human, but actually it's quite rare. And that's something we understand. Now, my problem was when I went for risk, because I now realize, and this was published in the Journal of Forensic Psychiatry, I now realize, and published in the book, The Child Abusers, it's all about the child abusers. I was actually trying not to add stigma to mental illness. Indeed, when I in the Department of Psychiatry, some of the adult psychiatrists were getting a bit over anxious that I was stressing there's a violent element. But look, we must make objective judgments, not be judgmental. And of course, you know, the people who damaged most in mental illness is the patient themselves with suicide. And of course, suicide as numbers, even in children, in children of say 15 to 18, are far higher than any child abuse related deaths. I'm not trying to say one is worse than or better than anything else, but you know, the mental health side, people need to realize just how serious suicide is in young people. And for me, a young person 15 to 24, that means their parents will be alive. And parents of a young person committed suicide have not only met the nightmare of every parent that the child should predecease them, the child should die by their own hand. I can't think of anything much worse. So looking at this, I had to rethink. As you know, we did a paper, you and I, Richard, in 2013 in British Journal of Social Work, Who Kills Children, reanalyzing the evidence. And in a way, this was a debt I owed to a former client of mine when I was in full-time practice, and I was the principal psychiatric social worker of an inpatient psychiatric adolescent unit. And I may have told this story before, when the children went on riot and got on the roof of the unit, and I had to coax them all down, and the last child, let's call her Anne, wouldn't come down. I was getting anxious because, you know, it's in a blizzard, it's in 6th of January, 6th of December, I've never forgotten it, ice and snow in Yorkshire, etc. And I actually lost I could panic and swore at her and said, "You can't talk like to me, Mr. Pritchard." I got back in the skylight. Richard, she fell into my arms. Then she turned round to me and said, Mr. Pritchard, you don't know what it's like when my mum's not well. But I did, because her mother would have a psychotic breakdown, would stand in front of the town hall and scream epithets and how people had raped her and this and kind of the other. And her friends would say, your mum's a nutter, your mum's a nutter. And one of the things we forget because we're so worried we don't want to add stigma, we forget what it must be like to be the child of a mentally ill person. When that mother or father is depressed or talks about killing themselves, or in my experience, who talks about let's kill together, I don't want to leave you behind. It happens. What's it like for a child when they hear the parent talk about the aliens, talk about explicit, bizarre sexual fears of paranoid delusions? What is it like for the child with the addicted alcohol and drug abusing parent? This is not being judgmental. I'm wanting people to remember the child. Manfred Bloiler, you may have heard of the word schizophrenia. His father, Max Bloiler, was the first to coin the word schizophrenia, fractured mind. And that to me is a glorious way of explaining it. It's fractured mind. It's not that mind doesn't exist, but it's all broken and it comes out in odd sorts of delusions. But the delusions are always content specific for the time. So when people have a breakdown, they'll tell you about the Russians coming, the Chinese, the IRA, or the aliens on the television, or what have you. Or they can hear, people can read their minds with all sorts of instruments and so on. But imagine what it must be like to be the child. Now, modern research is showing, and I'm going to quote Marion Brandon here, but they've been rather reluctant, but they're now recognizing that adverse childhood is related to not only poor educational outcomes, as you know, for our own work, but actually in terms of psychosocial or biopsychosocial development. And Marion Brandon's one of the recent report, she noted for the first time mental ill health. And this is the area which we have ignored for a long, long time, because people don't want to make judgments. For example, our recent work looking at these young boys who pose risk, sexual risk to children. Some of our colleagues, that's why they sent the research to us, were fearful that these young boys of 15 to 18 are on the cusp of becoming child sex abusers, which of course is the worst epithet label you can label anybody with our modern world. But what you and I saw was these boys came from the most appalling backgrounds, indeed themselves were victims of domestic violence, child sex abuse, exclusion from school, often in care and so forth. And of course, one of the things we have to recognize is that life experiences influences people's development. Let's just stand something on its head. I know this is a gear change. A late colleague of mine, David Barker, I want to pay tribute to him. He and I once had a kind of row in public, and he called me a controversialist because I was finding controversial things to research on. And I said, but David, you've developed the hypothesis, fetal origins of disease, fetal origins of disease. And what he showed was the early, literally before the child was born, you could predict behavior, illnesses in their 40s and 50s. I says, David, you became a social worker because what happened, he found in Hertfordshire a whole room full of health visitors' notes from the 1930s and was able to trace these people, 60% of them, trace them into adulthood. And what he was able to show was undernourished children or over-fat children or children under stress had a range of diseases in adulthood, the fetal origins of disease. So too with child abuse, child neglect, because I want to emphasize there's a massive difference between neglect and abuse. We've linked the two together to the detriment of the service. I think I may have mentioned in another interview, there was a woman, she had a fourth child, the other three had been taken into care. She'd got a child of three, ill-dressed 3-year-old in the supermarket, sucking a dummy, has gone to sleep. She meets a bloke, he persuades her to go for a drink. She puts a kid, hides the kid, he persuades her to move for the drink. 3 hours later, she suddenly wakes up and realizes she's forgotten where she put her son. She rings the police. They find the child dying of exposure. When we looked at these deaths, what I'd call negligent, feckless deaths, it was pure neglect, nothing intent at all. Then we looked at the psychotic deaths. The tragedy was some of these deaths were in love. A number of these parents had delusional ideas of HIV invasion, foreign invasion. They're killing their child before they can get HIV and things like this. Another was killing their child because they didn't want to leave them behind because they had to die themselves and so on. And that's the kind of abuse, which is very different. Whereas neglect starts at birth. And what modern neurosciences show, that when you and I are stressed, the brain releases cortisol. If you get too much cortisol in that first year of birth, it begins to impair the neurological development. So even mild stress now can be measurable impact. And the modern research is showing adverse childhood includes having a parent with a mental illness. These are not bad parents. And the worst thing is we can actually cure and manage most mental illness. I'm not asking for a moment to say automatic removal. Not at all. Not at all. What we want is an integrated, adequate psychiatric service, and that is psychosocial support, CBT, and appropriate low level of psychopharmacological treatment. Psychosocial and drugs work together remarkably. That's why a lot of our middle class patients sadly go privately, get the best of both worlds.
In fact, if I'm going to say, would it be reasonable to suggest that one of the reasons why child abuse related deaths have reduced is includes the improvement in mental health services? Is that fair?
You're absolutely right, Richard. We haven't published it yet, but the correlation between reduced suicides amongst women, young women of childbirth, because in fact, despite everything, they're getting a much better service from GP practice, mental health, than they used to do. At least that's our interpretation. So it's absolutely right. But they could even be better. You know, as you know, I used to have a mental health practice when I was in Southampton, and I would take on people with schizophrenia and with the GP and help to balance their drugs and offer psychosocial support. Sometimes, yes, occasionally for a year, sometimes 2 years, or they come back in crisis. You can manage it. Now, here's the thing. In Germany and in Norway in particular, they started a service, a preventative service, automatically for children of mentally ill parents. You and I have written in 2013, if the Dorset and Hampshire social workers had a thought mental health psychiatry, and if the adult psychiatrists had thought children, half the children who died would not have done so.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that if you speak to a child protection conference chair and you ask how easy or how readily the information comes from the adult psychiatrist, from the parent psychiatrist, it's not necessarily as ready as one would like. And I think that the attitude would possibly be that we would seek for for that first meeting with the psychiatrist, for the person who is in early psychosis, and for the psychiatrist to ask the question, are you a parent? And it comes back to what you were saying, was what's the experience of the child? The welfare of the child is paramount, and that may conflict with perhaps a psychiatrist's notion of who their patient is, but the law is clear. The law is clear, and I know I'll quote it, and I know there'll be challenges in terms of practice. The welfare of the child is paramount. That comes first.
You'll be pleased to know, Richard, I'm giving this seminar in depth to the Department of Psychiatry in the next term here in Southampton, and I have 3 psychiatrists backing me. The only thing they'll say, but Colin, we lack the resources. Why don't we have psychiatric social workers like you? Not me as a person, but a social worker who is immersed in mental health, because most of our approved colleagues are just dashing from one crisis to another because they don't have space to give preventative work. Yeah. And this is what I'm arguing with psychiatrists. Now, my daughter, as you know, is an independent reviewing officer, and she's been in the field of child protection and adoption for 20 years. And you know, I'm very much her hand maiden, whatever would the male equivalent would be, or the hand person would be. And she said, Dad, the trouble is psychiatrists can be so arrogant. And I would agree. And this is what we must have, is equal respect, disciplinary respect from the medical colleagues with the child protection service. So it could be an integrative. And if in fact we can say to the psychiatrist, because my argument is your patient will tell you their first priority is their children. You know, you and I have worked in the field for many years. I've never met a parent who wanted to be a bad parent. And, you know, a lot, as I said, some of the patients who are in their psychosis, they're desperately concerned for their children. They're unhappy for their children. That's why they sometimes involve them in their distress. So, you know, we can say not only does the law want to put the priority for the child, but the mentally ill parent would 99.99% times would want to put the child's interest at first. And that's what we could do. Now, here's the really good stuff. The Germans have had about 5 good projects now running, and it shows major impact over a 10-year period. And the proportion of adolescents with subsequent illnesses and problems have been markedly and measurably reduced. In Norway, it's become mandatory to have an automatic child service, a family supportive service for mental illness. And there's something from the EU, and I'm not being political, there's Camille project, which has been running for 5 years in 7 different countries, including Scotland, actually, but not in England, where they're developing what they call a empowerment of children and children and adolescents through the training of professionals working with children and adolescents. Because what needs to be, the kids need to understand what's happening. They need to understand their parents are ill. Because tragically, sometimes the child, particularly adolescent, will blame themselves. And particularly if there's a conflict. You know, the adolescent, after all, is an adolescent. So suddenly there's a family conflict with the parent who is in instability, will commit suicide. I've known kids blame themselves for their parents' suicide, or their parents' suicidal behaviour, or their parents' admission to psychiatric hospital. So, you know, we have to psychoeducate the children to understand, because also, of course, what's often hidden is sometimes the children, the adolescents in particular, become almost informal carers. So what we need, in one sense, is make blindingly obvious an integrated service that recognises the biological, psychological and social factors, plus the economic factors of families. So, you know, CBONE, integrated service, but with ability to specialise. So what we're recommending to our colleagues to think about a mental health child protection paradigm to prevent, because if you start preventing, you won't need protection later on. You start it early. So with that, you know, I recommend, if I was in Parliament, I commend to our colleagues the mental health child protection interface paradigm of Pritchard and Williams.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you.